guys, this is Derek Chang here to teach you more about the Vietnam War, a part of the actually rather heated Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War is one of the greatest failures of the US government, not only because the US lost, but because the American public discovered that their government had been lying to them for years. Kind of like how kids discover that Santa Claus isn't real.
Mr. Chang, do you mean the US government used to hand out presents on Christmas?
I was trying to make a comparison so you'd understand how betrayed Americans felt concerning their leaders. Not that I understand it myself, since I never believed in Santa Claus. Vietnam went back to the 1940s, but the Vietnam War began in 1954 during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, after the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Viet Minh in North Vietnam. The Viet Minh were the leaders of the resistance to the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, and to France's attempts to reclaim Vietnam as a colony after losing it to Japan in World War II. The US had a paranoid fear of communism, and under the domino theory, if one Asian country fell to communism, the rest of Asia would eventually follow, one nation at a time. So the US chose to support Diem, who was a fierce hater of communism, despite the fact that he was unpopular and corrupt. In 1961, a team sent by President John Kennedy advised that the US step up military and economic aid to combat the Viet Cong, Viet Minh sympathizers in the South. By 1962, the US had 9,000 troops in South Vietnam, compared to less than 800 in the 1950s. In 1963, Diem was overthrown and killed by some of his own generals, 3 weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated. The subsequent political turmoil led Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to increase US military support for South Vietnam. In 1964, it was reported that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked 2 US destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing Johnson to escalate the war even further, and US planes began the regular bombing raids codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder in February. In March 1965, Johnson, with the support of the American public, decided to send troops to Vietnam. By June, there were 82,000 American troops in Vietnam, and Johnson planned to send 100,000 more in July and another 100,000 in 1966. At this point, the anti-war movement in the US was growing, and people were becoming concerned about the war's escalation. Part of that was because for the first time in history, Americans were seeing footage of the war being brought into their homes by television. They saw the bombings, the napalm burning through the jungle and threatening Vietnamese civilians, and the fighting with guerrilla forces which, rather than face the US Army directly, used the cover of the jungle for deadly booby traps and ambushes. Another part was the disparity between what the government was telling the public about the war and what was actually happening. Johnson promised that victory was just around the corner, but that simply wasn't true. Rained down on Vietnam than the Allies used against the Axis powers in all of World War II. But the supply lines used by the Vietnam to aid the Viet Cong remained open nonetheless. Though the Viet Cong took many losses, their numbers were seemingly endless, and for the American Army, taking territories served no purpose. Because the Viet Cong hid among civilians, the troops didn't know who was friend and who was foe, especially because the Viet Cong were too good at covering their tracks. So, the fighting went on with the soldiers having no clear way to defeat their enemy. Meanwhile, they suffered physically and psychologically from the stress of combat, the risk of disease, and the harmful effects of exposure to chemicals like Agent Orange that the US spread all over South Vietnam in an attempt to get rid of the forests that were making it so easy for the Viet Cong to catch the American soldiers off guard. To escape the daily horrors, many soldiers indulged in alcohol, marijuana, and even heroin. Even worse, there were many cases of soldiers attacking their superiors, and tens of thousands were dishonorably discharged for desertion. Would you like to talk about how the war looked to people in the US?
Of course, Derek. Hi, my name is Jacob, and I will tell you guys more information about how the Vietnam War affected Americans at home.
At home, the public was split between people who now resented the government for continuing the war and people who thought that challenging the government was unpatriotic. However, more and more Americans were growing weary of the war's growing costs. Peace movement leaders protested that the North Vietnamese were fighting a patriotic war to rid their country of foreign oppressors, while the U.S. was supporting an undemocratic, corrupt military regime. Young men were suffering and dying, money was being lost, and defoliating chemicals like Agent Orange were damaging the environment and poisoning civilians and soldiers alike. An important event that fueled anti-war opinion was the Tet Offensive, a series of attacks launched by North Vietnam in 1968 that struck over 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns, proving the war was nowhere close to being over. In any case, years of seeing body bags on screen caused anti-war protests to eventually escalate into violence as the protesters felt that they were being ignored. Although North Vietnam and the US were holding peace talks in Paris, North Vietnam insisted on complete withdrawal of US forces while the US refused to accept military defeat or the spread of communism. The war dragged on and the carnage continued to horrify the public. Later in 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret overview of the government's involvement in Vietnam. They revealed that a lot of statements about the situations in Vietnam were untrue. In particular, there was an indication that the Gulf of Tonkin incident that led to the increase in U.S. involvement in 1965 never actually happened. Many Americans became even more cynical about the war after this, and later events that were seen as a continuation of a pointless conflict like the Christmas bombings in December 1972 earned President Nixon a lot of criticism.
Oh, hi, this is Lily, and continuing from Jacob, here are some significant consequences that occurred after the war. The strongest impact towards the US was that Americans started to doubt the country and government because of all the cruel things that happened during the war. Americans believed that it was a merciless attack on innocent Vietnam civilians. Laws and policies were changed, with Nixon replacing the military draft with an all volunteer force, and the voting age was lowered to 18. The war also severely crashed the US economy. In general, the US spent $168 billion on the Vietnam War. For the civilians, taxes had been increased dramatically to support the military. President Johnson decided to introduce a 10% income tax surcharge, which is considered by many economists too little and too late, and in turn also slowed down the economy rather than helping it. Okay guys, now it's time for the mystery document. Let's see what we have here. I know that many veterans of Vietnam will gather today, some of them perhaps by the wall, and they're still helping each other on. They were quite a group, the boys of Vietnam, boys who fought a terrible and vicious war without enough support from home, boys who were dodging bullets while we debated the efficacy of the battle. It was often our poor who fought in that war. It was that unpampered boys of the working class who picked up their rifles and went on the march. They learned not to rely on us. They learned to rely on each other, and they were special in another way. They chose to be faithful. They chose to reject the fashionable skepticism of their time. They chose to believe and answer the call of duty. They had the wild, wild courage of youth. They seized certainty from the heart of an ambivalent age. They stood for something. I think it was President Reagan's memorial speech about the Vietnam War. Ironically, a very positive speech about a pretty negative event.
Another result that emerged from the Vietnam War was that Vietnam was unified under a communist government. It's still a communist nation today, one of only 4 in the entire world. No surprise, given how communist nations tend to fall short of communism's ideals and get themselves overthrown. Like how the Soviet Union collapsed after World War II when people got fed up with Stalin's terrible dictatorship. Vietnam's losses included much of the country's infrastructure, and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese people had died, while 12 million more became refugees. Today, we look back on the Vietnam War as a blight on American history, and most people would say that it should never have happened in the first place. However, we can say that it taught this country a lesson in making sure to check if our leaders are being honest with us. It also acts as a reminder that we are not infallible and we can make mistakes. A big reason why we lost the Vietnam War was because we did not understand the enemy. They weren't fighting for communism. They were fighting for Vietnam itself and for independence. They were determined, unafraid to take heavy losses, and they knew the terrain far better than the American army did. The US did not have the advantage in military strategy and was far less motivated, which serves to prove that we can't just go into another country and expect the natives to make way for our own agenda. Most importantly, it puts us in a mindset for pursuing peace in our time through words rather than weapons. Hopefully. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next year. This video wouldn't exist without our sources and you guys. So long.